The Kentucky air clung thick and heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves as Alara Vance's rental car bumped along the gravel road. Towering oaks and dense thickets of rhododendron pressed in from either side, their branches forming a tangled canopy that filtered the afternoon sun into a dim, greenish haze. The only sounds were the crunch of tires on stone and the distant, lonely cry of a hawk. The woods felt less like a landscape and more like a presence, ancient and watchful. Alara was a journalist, but not the kind that chased scandals. She sought stories, the kind that lived in the quiet places, told in whispers and half-remembered details. Her notepad lay on the passenger seat, blank except for a single, cryptic line from an old archived letter. The purest blooded woman in the Kentucky woods. They say she bears his children. It was a fragment, a ghost of a rumor that had led her deep into this isolated corner of the state. She had stopped for gas an hour ago in a town that barely registered on the map, and the attendant's demeanor had shifted when she'd asked about the old families in the hills. His friendly drawl had tightened, his eyes darting toward the tree line. "Some hollows are best left to themselves," he'd said, handing her change with a hand that seemed in a hurry to let go. Another fragment. Now, as she drove deeper, the silence of the woods felt amplified. It was a listening silence. She rolled down her window, the humid air washing over her, and she could have sworn she heard it. Not the wind, but a low, murmuring whisper that seemed to weave through the pines. It was probably just the creek she'd passed, its sound carried on a trick of the breeze. But for a moment, it sounded like voices, hushed and secretive, discussing the stranger who had come to their gates. She turned off the engine, the sudden quiet profound. The woods were waiting. The gravel gave way to cracked asphalt as Alara reached the town's solitary cluster of buildings. The general store stood at the center, its white paint faded to a dull gray, the wooden porch sagging with age. A screen door, patched in one corner with a square of wire mesh, swung faintly in the humid breeze. Above, a slow-turning ceiling fan pushed the thick air around in lazy circles, its motor emitting a low, persistent hum. Inside, the air was cooler, smelling of polished wood, coffee, and the faint, sweet scent of apples. Sunlight streamed through the dusty windows, illuminating motes of flour drifting in the air. The floorboards, worn smooth by generations of footsteps, creaked under her weight. Shelves were lined with canned goods, their labels softened by time, and glass jars of pickled eggs and beets glowed like jewels in the dim light. An old man behind the counter, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, looked up from polishing a glass. His eyes, pale and watery, tracked her movement with a cautious curiosity. A woman in a faded floral dress, selecting a bag of flour, fell silent as Alara passed, her gaze dropping to the floor. Alara approached the counter, offering a small smile. "Afternoon." The man gave a slow nod, setting the glass down. "Afternoon. Don't get many new faces up here." His voice was a soft rasp, like dry leaves. "I'm just doing some research," Alara said, keeping her tone light, respectful. "Looking into some of the older families that settled these hills." The woman with the flour clutched her bag tighter and moved toward the door without a word. The screen door slapped shut behind her. The old man watched her go, then turned his weary gaze back to Alara. He picked up his cloth and resumed polishing the already gleaming glass. "Lots of old families," he said non-committally. "I've heard a particular story," Alara ventured carefully, "about a woman who lived deep in the woods, kept to her own. They called her the purest blooded woman." The polishing stopped. The man's knuckles gripping the cloth were white. The only sound was the hum of the fan and the distant buzz of a fly against a window pane. He didn't look at her, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the jars of candy on the counter. "Some stories ain't for telling," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Some things are best left where they lie, buried." "I don't mean any disrespect," Alara said softly. "I'm just trying to understand." He finally met her eyes, and in his, she saw not hostility, but a deep, resonant fear. "Understanding ain't always a kindness, miss. That family, They believed in keepin' to their own. Keepin' the line pure. He said the word not with pride, but with a hollow reverence that made the air feel colder. They paid a price for it. A heavy one. Best you turn your car around. The woods don't take kindly to folks pokin' at old graves. He turned his back to her, signaling the end of the conversation, and began rearranging bottles on a shelf with a quiet, final clink. The exchange was over. Alara stood for a moment in the heavy silence, the man's words settling around her like a chill. She had come for fragments, and she had found them, each one shrouded in fear and a warning to leave the past, and the woods, alone. The old man's warning lingered in Alara's mind like a stubborn chill as she left the store, but it only solidified her resolve. She was not there to exploit, to sensationalize. She was there to listen, to understand the weight of the silence that clung to these hills. The story was a fragile, painful thing, and she felt a journalist's duty, not to tear it open, but to preserve its truth with respect. Following the vague directions she'd pieced together, a mention of a rusted gate off the old logging road, a creek that split near a lightning-scarred pine. She parked her car where the asphalt dissolved back into wilderness. The air was even heavier here, thick with the scent of loam and blooming mountain laurel. The forest canopy closed overhead, casting the world into a twilight green. The usual chorus of the woods, the chatter of squirrels, the calls of birds was absent, replaced by a profound, watchful silence. Every step on the soft, needle-strewn path was amplified. The rustle of her jacket, the crunch of a fallen twig beneath her boot, seemed like intrusions. She moved slowly, her eyes scanning the dense undergrowth. Vines thick as ropes hung from ancient oaks, and the sunlight that did filter through dappled the forest floor in shifting, uneasy patterns. It felt less like she was walking through the woods and more like she was being allowed passage. For now. Her senses were heightened, straining against the quiet. Once, she froze, certain she had heard the snap of a branch somewhere to her left. She stood perfectly still, her breath held, but the sound did not repeat. There was only the faint sigh of the wind moving through the high leaves, a sound that could almost be mistaken for a whispered breath. Was it her imagination? Or were there shapes moving just at the edge of her vision, vanishing behind tree trunks when she turned her head? The path began to fade, becoming little more than a suggestion in the vegetation. She pushed aside a curtain of thorny bramble, and there, nestled in the dark hollow of a gnarled beech tree, something caught her eye. It was a doll, clumsily fashioned from faded calico and rough, bound twigs. Its face was blank, stitched with dark thread, and one of its arms was missing. It was not discarded trash. It was placed, hidden deliberately in the tree's embrace, as if waiting. A cold dread prickled at the base of her spine, a primal unease at this artifact of childhood in such a lonely, silent place. Yet, beneath the dread, a powerful curiosity flared. It was a sign. Someone had been here. Someone, perhaps, was still here. She carefully did not touch it, leaving the sad little sentinel in its hiding place, and pressed onward, deeper into the watchful, waiting woods. Alara stood motionless before the hollow, her breath shallow. The crude doll, with its frayed cloth and rough-hewn twig limbs, seemed to pulse with a silent, sorrowful energy. It was not a thing carelessly lost, but intentionally concealed, a secret kept by the tree itself. The blank, stitched face seemed to watch her, a tiny guardian of a story she was only beginning to grasp. A sudden rustle in the undergrowth, too close and too deliberate to be the wind, snapped her attention away. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She scanned the dense wall of green, but saw nothing, only the shifting patterns of light and shadow. The silence that followed was deeper, heavier, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. The absence of birdsong, which she had noted before, now felt like a vacuum. She took a slow, careful step back from the tree, her boot sinking into the soft earth. The urge to flee was a cold wire tightening in her chest, a primal response to the uncanny discovery and the feeling of being observed. But the journalist in her, the seeker of truths that others wanted buried, held firm. This was why she had come. This doll, this sad and hidden object, was the first tangible thread. It spoke of a child. It spoke of a life lived in these isolated woods, away from prying eyes. Her gaze swept the area around the beech tree, looking for any other sign. A footprint, a worn path, anything. The forest floor was a tapestry of moss, fallen leaves, and decaying wood, revealing nothing. Yet, the feeling of presence persisted, a prickling at the nape of her neck. Was it the owner of the doll, watching her from the shadows? Or was it the accumulated weight of the secrets these trees had witnessed, pressing in on her? She took out her small digital camera, her movements slow and respectful. She did not move the doll. Instead, she took several photographs of it in its natural hiding place, the flash stark and unnatural in the dim green light. The click of the shutter was a violent sound in the stillness, a violation of the quiet. She half expected a reaction. Another rustle, a voice, but none came. Only the watchful silence remained. Pocketing the camera, she made a decision. She would not take the thread with her. She would leave it here, a marker. Turning, she began to retrace her steps, each one feeling more exposed than the last. The path back seemed longer, the woods denser. Every snap of a twig underfoot echoed, and every shift of a branch in the breeze made her pulse jump. She was leaving with more than she came with. Not just an image on a camera, but a deep, unsettling dread mixed with a compulsion to understand the story behind the stitched eyes and silent, watchful woods. The first trail had yielded its clue, and it had changed everything. The memory of the doll, its blank stitched gaze, followed Alara back to her car and through a restless night at the lone roadside motel. It was a silent accusation, a question woven from calico and twine. The old man in the general store had spoken of a price paid, and the woman at the center of the rumor, Cora. Alara needed more than fragments. She needed context. The next morning, following a tip murmured by a waitress who refused to meet her eyes. If anyone'll talk, it's old Elias, but he won't thank you for it. Alara found herself on a winding dirt track that led to a tar paper shack nestled against a steep hillside. A thin plume of smoke rose from a rusted stovepipe. The air was sharp with the scent of wood smoke and pine. Elias was older than she had imagined, a man whittled down by time and weather. He sat on a stump, mending a fishing net with gnarled fingers, and watched her approach with a weary resignation, as if he'd been expecting her. His eyes were the color of the winter sky, holding a deep and settled sorrow. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Alara began, keeping her distance, her voice soft. "I just want to understand about the family in the woods. About Cora." He was silent for a long time, his fingers still working the net. A jay called from a nearby pine, the sound sharp in the stillness. Finally, he sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of the hills themselves. "Ain't my story to tell. But I suppose silence ain't protected anyone." Either he gestured to a nearby log. "Sit." She did, the rough bark biting through her jeans. "Their land's been theirs for generations," he began, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Back past the big flood, past the depression. They were always apart, proud, suspicious. Her parents, they were hard people, believed in keeping their bloodline untouched by the outside. Saw it as a duty, a purity." He spat the word into the dirt, as if it had a bad taste. "And Cora?" Alara prompted gently. A different pain flickered in his ancient eyes. Cora was different, bright, had a light in her when she was a girl. I saw it at a distance, at a harvest gathering decades back. But that light was for her family, for her brother Silas. They were always a pair even as children, thick as thieves, protecting each other. Their world was that land, those woods, and each other. Outsiders weren't welcome. Never were. He fell silent again, staring at the distant tree line as if he could see through the years. "The children," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "You'd see 'em sometimes if you were huntin' and got turned around near their creek. Pale little things, shy as forest deer. They'd scatter like leaves in the wind if you got too close. Never said a word. Just watched." He shook his head slowly. "It wasn't right. Everyone knew it. But what was there to be done? It was their way. Their choice. Was it her choice? Alara asked, the question hanging in the air between them. Elias looked at her then, and the sorrow in his gaze was profound. When you're raised with a duty hammered into your bones, when your whole world is one cabin and one face, choice looks different. It was a prison built of love and loyalty, and she was its keeper. She loved him, sure, as a sister, as a partner in that isolated life. But it was a love forged in that same twisted duty. He tossed the mended net aside. That's all. That's enough. Their tragedy is theirs. Let it lie. He stood, his joints cracking, and without another word, he turned and walked into his shack, closing the door softly behind him. The conversation was over. Alara remained on the log, the old-timer's words painting a picture far more tragic and complex than any sensational rumor. It was a story of a bright-eyed girl, a fierce and isolating belief, and the pale, silent children who were its legacy. The dread she felt was no longer for herself, but for the profound, generations-deep sadness that lived in the woods behind the rusted gate. That night, the silence of the motel room felt different, charged, expectant. The old-timer's words echoed in Alara's mind, painting the darkness with images of pale, watchful children and a love warped by duty. Sleep was a distant country. She rose and went to the window, pushing aside the thin curtain to stare out into the blackness. The moon was a sliver behind scudding clouds, casting the world in shades of deep blue and charcoal. The tree line at the edge of the motel's gravel lot was a solid wall of shadow. The air was still, heavy with the damp chill of the Kentucky night. And then she saw it. A movement. A shift within the deeper blackness of the pines. Her breath caught. She leaned closer, squinting, her palms pressed against the cool glass. There, just beyond the last of the weak light from the motel's sign, stood a figure. Tall, gaunt, almost spectral in its stillness. It was a man, his frame lean and angular, his clothes dark and merging with the shadows. But it was his eyes that held her, 2 points of intense focus, gleaming with a faint reflection of the distant light. They were fixed on her window. A cold dread, sharp and immediate, lanced through her. It was him, Silas, the brother from Elias's story, the guardian of the secret. She did not move, could not move, locked in that unnerving gaze across the darkness. He made no gesture, gave no sign of threat. He was simply there, a sentinel from the world she was probing, a silent reminder that the past was not dead, but watching. Then, as swiftly as he had appeared, he was gone. A deeper shadow seemed to absorb him, and the space between the trees was empty once more. Alara blinked, straining her eyes, wondering if the stress and the late hour had conjured the vision from the gloom. But the impression was too vivid, too real. The stark height, the hollowed cheeks, the piercing familiarity of those eyes, so like the description Elias had given. She let the curtain fall back into place, her heart thudding unevenly. The room felt smaller, the walls thinner. Was she being watched, or was her mind, saturated with the tragic tale, now painting its own ghosts onto the landscape? The line between reality and imagination had blurred, leaving her with a deep, crawling paranoia. The woods were no longer just keeping their secrets. They had sent a messenger. And the message was clear. She was seen. The next morning, the memory of the gaunt figure in the trees hung over Alara like a shroud. The encounter, whether real or imagined, had solidified her purpose. She needed facts, something tangible to anchor the whispers and shadows. The local church, a white-clapboard structure with a leaning steeple, seemed the most logical place to search for the bare bones of the story. The dates, the names, the cold arithmetic of lives lived and lost. The air inside was cool and carried the faint, sweet and sour scent of old hymnals, beeswax, and undisturbed dust. Sunlight streamed through stained glass, casting colored lozenges of light on the worn pews. A stooped, elderly caretaker, when asked about archives, had merely gestured with a trembling hand toward a door at the back, his eyes avoiding hers. Records rooms down there. Mind the step. Ain't been properly sorted in, well, a long time. The room was a crypt for paper. Towering shelves bowed under the weight of ledgers and boxes, all coated in a fine, gray dust that stirred into the air with her every movement, catching in her throat. It was a place of silence and forgotten things. In a corner, she found a stack of large, leather-bound volumes. Their spines cracked and titles faded to illegibility. She pulled the first one down, the leather gritty under her fingers. The pages were brittle, yellowed at the edges. The ink faded to a watery brown. She began to turn them slowly, carefully, the rustle of paper loud in the silent room. The entries were a history of the hollow. Births, deaths, marriages, spanning decades. Her search felt aimless until she found the right ledger, its cover marked with the approximate dates Elias had mentioned. She ran a finger down the columns of spidery script. And then she saw it. Cora. The name appeared again and again in the mother column. The script varied slightly over the years, growing shakier perhaps, but the name was a constant. Her breath hitched. She turned the page. And another. The entries spanned nearly 30 years. But it was the father column that made the air leave her lungs. In each entry, for every single child, the space was not blank. It was marked with the same stark, deliberate punctuation. A single slashing dash. The mark was a void, a refusal, a statement. It was more telling than any name could have been. It was the family's ideology made manifest in ink and paper, a denial of any outside influence, a testament to a terrible, isolating purity. She began to count, her finger tracing down the fragile pages, her lips moving silently. The numbers mounted, one after another, a relentless procession of lives ushered into that secluded world. The sheer volume was staggering, a relentless biological fact that dwarfed the whispered rumors. It was no longer a story. It was a documented tragedy, recorded in dust and dashes, hidden in the quiet back room of a decaying church. The horror was not in what was written, but in what that single, repeated mark so defiantly, so tragically, represented. The dust from the church records seemed to cling to Alara's skin and clothes, a fine, gritty residue of the past she had unearthed. The repeated dash in the ledger's father column burned behind her eyes, a stark, silent scream across decades. She needed air, space to process the cold, factual horror of it. But as she stepped out of the dim church and into the hazy afternoon light, she found she was not alone. A county sheriff's cruiser, dust-coated and looking as much a part of the landscape as the old oaks, was parked beside her rental car. Leaning against its hood was the sheriff himself, a man in his late 50s with a weary, capable face and eyes that had seen too much. He pushed his hat back on his forehead as she approached, his expression not hostile, but firm, resigned. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice a low, gravelly drawl. It wasn't a question. He knew who she was, why she was here. "Sheriff," she acknowledged, stopping a few feet away. The ledger's weight felt immense in her bag. "Heard you've been askin questions. Pokin' around the old church records." He didn't wait for her to confirm it. "I'm gonna ask you, politely, to consider dropping this." Alara met his gaze. He wasn't trying to intimidate her. He looked like a man tasked with closing a wound that kept getting picked at. "I'm a journalist. I'm just trying to understand." "I know what you're trying to do," he interrupted, his tone still even, but leaving no room for argument. "And I'm telling you that some histories are too painful to stir up. That family, they have a right to their isolation. They've paid for it in ways I hope you never have to comprehend." He pushed off from the car and took a step closer, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. "This ain't some ghost story for a city paper. It's real. It's their life, their grief. Folks who went poking around in the past, thinking they were uncovering some dark secret. They didn't always come back the same. Some things once seen can't be unseen. And it don't do anybody any good." He wasn't threatening her. He was warning her of a contagion, not of violence, but of sorrow. He was the guardian of the town's peace, and that meant keeping this particular tragedy buried. "The children," Alara began, the image of the dash repeating itself in her mind. The sheriff's face tightened almost imperceptibly. "Are best left to the care of their family. We look out for our own here. And that means respecting boundaries that were set a long, long time ago. For everyone's sake." He looked toward the tree line, toward the hills that hid the rusted gate and the overgrown path. "The world's moved on. It's kinder to let some things lie." He gave her a final, measuring look, tipped his hat, and got into his cruiser. The engine turned over with a rumble that shattered the afternoon quiet. He didn't drive away immediately, just sat there. A silent, sober reminder of the collective desire to let sleeping dogs lie. Alara stood rooted to the spot, the sheriff's words layering over the old-timer's tale and the cold evidence of the ledger. The story was no longer a collection of fragments. It was a wall, and she had just been told, firmly and finally, not to try to climb it. The sheriff's warning was a stone in Alara's gut, heavy and cold. His words. Asterisk folks who went poking around didn't always come back the same asterisk. Echoed the old-timer's weary resignation and the silent accusation in the church ledger's dashes. But the compulsion that had drawn her this far was not so easily dismissed. It was no longer mere curiosity. It was a need to bear witness, to understand the full weight of the tragedy she had only glimpsed through records and rumors. To turn back now would feel like a betrayal of the silent children, their existences reduced to a faded mark on a page. She waited until the sheriff's cruiser was long gone. The dust settled back onto the gravel road before she moved. From her bag, she retrieved the small, hand-drawn map Elias had sketched in the dirt with a stick, its lines crude but its landmarks clear. The lightning-scarred pine, the twin forks of the creek, the place where the old fence line was swallowed by blackberry brambles. It was a path meant to be forgotten. Driving slowly, she parked her car farther down the logging road than before, concealing it behind a thicket of young poplars. The air was still and thick, the humidity clinging to her skin like a damp cloth. The woods here were older, denser, the canopy so complete it felt like stepping into a different time of day. The silence was profound, a palpable entity that seemed to absorb sound before it could travel. Using Elias's map, she pushed past the scarred pine, its trunk a twisted monument to some past violence. The ground underfoot was soft, a carpet of moss and decaying leaves that muffled her steps. The path, if it could be called that, was not a trail but a suggestion, a slight parting in the undergrowth, a series of faint depressions in the earth that might have been made by animal or human feet decades ago. It was being reclaimed, inch by inch, by thorny vines and saplings that reached out to snag her clothes as she passed. She moved with a deliberate slowness, her senses straining. The woods were watching. She felt it in the prickle on her neck, in the way the light seemed to avoid certain patches of shadow. Once, a branch cracked sharply to her right, and she froze, heart hammering, her hand going to the can of pepper spray in her pocket. But nothing emerged. There was only the slow, patient silence, and the feeling that she was being allowed to proceed, for now, deeper into the heart of a secret that had been kept for generations. The overgrown path was not just a route. It was a barrier, and she was crossing it. The thorns caught at her sleeves like pleading fingers as Alara pushed deeper, the undergrowth thickening with every step. The air grew heavier, cooler, carrying the scent of damp stone and something else, something faintly sweet and cloying, like decayed flowers. The faint trail she'd been following dissolved entirely, swallowed by a wall of ivy and wild grapevine. For a moment, she hesitated, Elias's map feeling useless in her pocket. She was truly lost. Then she saw it. A break in the green, a subtle parting in the vegetation that seemed almost intentional. Pushing aside a final curtain of vine, she stumbled into a small, sunken clearing. The air left her lungs. It was a graveyard, but not one marked by marble or grief-stricken grandeur. This was a place of quiet, desperate surrender. The plot was small, hemmed in by ancient, gnarled dogwoods whose branches hung low like weary mourners. The markers were crude, heartbreakingly simple. Some were rough, unshaped stones, barely taller than her hand, sunk deep into the mossy earth. Others were wooden crosses, their arms lashed together with rotting twine, the wood weathered to a silvery gray, the names once carved upon them erased by decades of rain and wind. She moved among them slowly, her boots sinking into the soft, spongy ground. The silence here was different from the watchful stillness of the woods. It was a settled, final silence. A peace that was not peaceful at all. She began to count, her throat tight. 1. A small stone almost completely covered in emerald moss. 2. A cross so faded it was little more than a pale shadow. 3. A sunken patch of earth, marked only by a ring of white quartz stones. 4. 5. 6. The numbers climbed, each one a cold weight in her chest. They were all so small. These were not the graves of adults. They were the resting places of children. The children from the ledger. The ones whose father was a dash. 17. 19. Her breath hitched. She reached the edge of the clearing, where the roots of a massive oak cradled the earth. There, nearly hidden in the tree's embrace, was the 20th marker. It was the smallest of all, a smooth river stone with no inscription, looking as if it had been placed only yesterday. 20. The number hung in the air, final and absolute. The chill that went down her spine was not from fear, but from a devastating, soul-crushing comprehension. This was the price Elias had spoken of. This was the heavy cost of that hollow, dash-marked purity. It wasn't just a story of isolation or a twisted belief. It was a chronicle of loss, written in 20 tiny, nameless graves hidden where the world would never have to see. She stood amidst them, a trespasser in a garden of sorrow. The full, horrific truth of Cora's life laid bare in the silent, mossy earth. The graveyard silence clung to Alara as she forced herself to move away, each step feeling like a violation. The image of those 20 small, sunken plots was seared behind her eyes, a quiet, terrible confirmation of everything she had feared. The path beyond the burial ground was even more obscured, as if the woods themselves sought to hide the heart of this sorrow from any further intrusion. Thorns snatched at her clothes, and low branches seemed to reach out as she pushed through, guided now by a grim determination rather than any clear trail. The air grew stiller, the light dimmer under the thickening canopy. And then, through a final screen of weeping willow branches, she saw it. The cabin was exactly as Elias had described, yet the reality of it was a physical blow. It was a structure of sheer will, not craft. Its logs were dark with age and moisture, the chinking between them crumbling to dust in places. The roof sagged like a tired spine, patched in spots with rusted tin and rotting shingles. A stone chimney, stained black with decades of smoke, leaned precariously against one wall. The porch was a warped platform of splintered wood, its steps missing entirely, leaving a 2-foot drop to the weed-choked ground. And on that porch, in a rocking chair so worn its original shape was a memory, sat a woman. Cora. She was ancient, her body folded into the chair like a paper leaf, her hands, veined and knotted with arthritis, resting on her lap. Her hair, a wispy cloud of white, was pulled back from a face that was a landscape of deep lines and sunken hollows. She wore a faded, patched dress of a forgotten style, its fabric thin from countless washings. But her eyes, they were not the eyes of a faded old woman. They were a pale, sharp blue, and they were fixed on Alara with an unnerving, unwavering intensity. There was no welcome in that gaze, but no hostility either. It was a pure, unblinking assessment, a silent acknowledgement of the stranger who had finally arrived at her gate. She did not speak, did not move. The only sound was the faint, dry creak of the rocker as she shifted her weight almost imperceptibly. She was simply watching, a sentinel at the edge of her world. Her sharp, tired eyes holding decades of a story Alara had only begun to unravel. For a long moment, Alara and the woman simply looked at one another. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of wood smoke, damp earth, and something else. Something like dried herbs and old sorrow. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic counterpoint to the slow, almost imperceptible creak of the rocking chair. She opened her mouth, unsure what to say, how to begin. Then, the cabin door behind Cora swung inward without a sound. A man stepped out onto the porch, moving with a silent, fluid grace that belied his size. He was tall and gaunt, his frame all sharp angles and taut muscle beneath worn, dark clothing. His hair was a streaked mix of gray and black, tied back from a face that was deeply lined and weathered by sun and wind. But it was his eyes that held her frozen, the same pale, piercing eyes she had seen in the trees outside her motel window. Silas. He did not look at Alara immediately. His gaze went first to Cora, a silent check, a communication that passed between them in the space of a breath. It was a look of fierce, unwavering protectiveness, layered with a deep and weary familiarity. Only then did his eyes shift to Alara. There was no anger in his expression, no threat. Instead, there was a profound, unsettling stillness, an intensity that felt like a physical pressure. He saw everything. Her dusty clothes, her camera bag, the fear and determination warring on her face. He saw the trespass she represented. He moved to stand just behind Cora's chair, one hand coming to rest lightly on its high back. The gesture was not possessive, but guardian. He was a part of the cabin, the porch, the very air, a fixed point in the isolated world they had built. His presence was immense, not just physically, but in the weight of silent history he carried. He was the brother, the partner, the father of the dashes in the ledger, the guardian of the 20 small graves. And his gaze, locked on Alara, made it abundantly clear that any harm, any disrespect, would not be tolerated. The woods had been watching, and now they had shown their face. Cora's gaze did not waver. After a long moment, she gave a single, slow nod, her eyes flicking toward the cabin door. It was not an invitation, but an acknowledgement. Silas's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on the back of her chair, his own stare a silent, unmoving warning. Then, with a grace that was unsettling, he turned and disappeared back into the dark interior. Alara remained where she was, unsure if she should move. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant cry of a crow and the soft, dry creak of Cora's rocker. The woman finally spoke, her voice a raspy whisper, like wind through dry corn husks. "You'll take a cup of tea?" It was not a question. Alara nodded, her own voice feeling trapped in her throat. "Thank you." She approached the porch slowly, her boots crunching on the dry leaves. The missing steps forced her to haul herself up onto the warped boards, a clumsy, undignified movement under Cora's unblinking scrutiny. The old woman did not offer help, merely watched. Inside, the cabin was a study in sparse survival. The main room was dim, lit only by the light from the open door and a small, grimy window. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, cold and filled with ash. The air smelled of wood smoke, dried herbs, and a faint, underlying scent of lye soap. The furniture was rough-hewn and ancient. A scarred table, 2 mismatched chairs, a cupboard with doors that didn't quite close. But amidst the starkness were signs of the children. A small, hand-whittled horse on the hearth, a tiny chair in the corner with its woven rush seat meticulously mended, a pile of neatly folded clothes on a bench, their fabric faded and thin but carefully patched. Silas stood at a cast-iron stove in the corner, his back to her, pouring hot water from a kettle into 2 chipped enamel mugs. He did not turn. His silence was a wall. Cora gestured with a bony finger toward one of the chairs at the table. Alara sat. Silas brought the mugs over, setting one before her without meeting her eyes. The tea was dark, steaming, and smelled strongly of some wild, bitter herb. He placed the other mug in front of the empty chair opposite Alara, then retreated to lean against the doorframe, his arms crossed over his chest. His eyes, those pale, piercing eyes, were fixed on her once more, a silent, unwavering sentinel. Cora slowly rose from her rocker and came inside, her movements stiff and pained. She settled into the chair across from Alara, wrapping her gnarled hands around her mug but not drinking. The heavy silence descended again, thick and suffocating. It was a silence that had been decades in the making, woven from isolation, loss, and a history too painful to give voice to. Alara took a tentative sip of the tea. It was strong and left a medicinal aftertaste on her tongue. She cleared her throat softly. "The children's toys," she began, her voice too loud in the quiet room. "They're very—" Cora's sharp eyes snapped to hers, and the words died in Alara's throat. The old woman did not speak, did not nod, did not shake her head. She simply held Alara's gaze, and in it was a lifetime of refusal. The message was clear. Some questions would not be answered. Some doors would not be opened. So they sat. Alara sipped her bitter tea. Cora stared into the depths of her own mug, and Silas watched from the doorway, his presence a constant, silent reminder of the boundaries of this world, boundaries that were not to be crossed with words. The only sounds were the pop of the cooling stove and the weight of all that was left unsaid. The bitter tea sat heavy in Alara's stomach, its medicinal taste lingering like the silence that filled the cabin. Her eyes, desperate for something to anchor her in the stifling atmosphere, roamed the sparse room, over the mended clothes and the small, whittled toy on the hearth. They came to rest on the mantelpiece above the cold fireplace. It was mostly bare, dust gathering in the grooves of the rough-hewn wood, but tucked behind a small, cracked vase holding a few dried wildflowers, its edges curled and yellowed with age, was a photograph. It was so faded it seemed to be dissolving back into the paper from which it was born. Leaning forward slightly, Alara could just make out the figures. A young Cora, her face unlined, her hair dark and thick, pulled back in a severe style that did nothing to diminish the startling clarity of her eyes. Even in the faded sepia tones, those eyes held a fierce, defiant light. Beside her, standing close enough that their shoulders touched, was a young man, Silas. His face, younger but already set in the same grim lines, was turned slightly toward her. His arm was linked through hers, not in a romantic gesture, but in a pose of solid, unbreakable alliance. Their expressions were what held Alara captive. It was not the happiness of youth, nor the softness of love. Cora's jaw was set, her gaze direct and challenging, as if staring down the lens of the camera, and the world it represented. Silas's look was softer, but no less intense. It was fixed on her with a devotion that was absolute, layered with a deep, aching sorrow that seemed to emanate from the paper itself. They looked less like sweethearts and more like two soldiers standing back to back against a siege, bound together by a duty that was both their fortress and their prison. The photograph was not displayed. It was hidden, placed behind another object as if it were a thing to be remembered but not seen, a truth too painful to confront daily yet too foundational to ever discard. It was a captured moment from a time before the 20 dashes in the ledger, before the 20 small graves, a testament to the complex, tragic bond that had built this isolated world and sustained its terrible, heartbreaking cost. Alara looked from the faded image to the aged woman sipping her tea in stony silence, and felt the full, devastating weight of the decades that stretched between them. The silence in the cabin stretched, thick and impenetrable. Alara set her empty mug on the rough table, the clink of enamel on wood unnaturally loud. Cora's gaze remained fixed on some middle distance, her hands still wrapped around her own untouched tea. Silas had not moved from the doorway, his watchful presence a constant, low hum of tension. The air was heavy with the unspoken, with the weight of the photograph's young, defiant faces and the quiet evidence of children that filled the room. A faint sound seeped through the walls of the cabin, so subtle at first that Alara thought it was the wind moving through the high pines. But it grew, resolving into a high, lilting thread of laughter. Then another, and another, weaving together into the unmistakable, ethereal sound of children at play. Alara's head came up, her eyes darting toward the single grimy window. The light outside was softening into the deep gold of late afternoon, but the dense woods beyond were already pooling with shadow. Cora's expression did not change. She gave no indication of having heard anything. Silas, however, shifted almost imperceptibly, his shoulders tightening, his gaze cutting toward the door. The sound was not coming from inside the cabin, but from the woods that surrounded it, echoing directionless, as if carried on the breeze from a great distance. Alara rose slowly from her chair, drawn to the window. The laughter continued, a ghostly chorus that seemed to dance just at the edge of hearing. It was joyful, carefree, and utterly chilling in its context. She pressed her face close to the cool, dirty glass, peering out into the gathering dusk. Movement, a flicker of pale color between the dark trunks of the trees. A small shape darting behind a thick rhododendron. Another, a little farther off, a flash of white that might have been a shirt or a dress. They were there and then gone, leaving only the rustle of disturbed leaves and the fading echo of their play. Her breath fogged the glass. She wiped it clean with her sleeve, straining to see more, to make out a clear form, a face. But the woods offered only glimpses, suggestions. The laughter seemed to circle the cabin, now from the left, now from the right, never closer, never farther. A haunting, merry orbit around their isolated world. She turned back to the room. Cora was watching her now, those pale, sharp eyes holding a deep, unfathomable knowledge. There was no smile on her face, no warmth, only a profound, weary acknowledgement of the sounds that filled the air. Silas's jaw was tight, his protective stance more pronounced. He knew what was out there. He was listening for any change in the pattern, any sign of distress or intrusion. The laughter swelled for a moment, a bright, bubbling crescendo, and then began to fade, drifting away into the depths of the forest until only the whisper of the wind remained. The silence that rushed back in felt deeper, heavier than before. Alara stood by the window, her heart thumping a slow, steady rhythm of dread and awe. Were they the surviving children, kept hidden in the woods, their existence a secret to be protected at all costs? Or were they echoes, the ghosts of the 20 small graves she had stood amongst, their laughter a memory woven into the very fabric of the trees? The line between the living and the lost, between reality and the profound sorrow of this place, had blurred into nothingness. The woods held their children close, in one form or another, and the sound of their play was the most beautiful and terrifying thing Alara had ever heard. The ghostly laughter seemed to follow Alara all the way back to town, a haunting melody woven into the rustle of leaves and the hum of the rental car's engine. It echoed in the silent spaces of her mind, blurring the lines between the living and the lost, between the children's small, mended clothes in the cabin and the 20 sunken graves. She needed to anchor herself back in the world of facts, in a story that had a beginning. She needed to see Elias again. She found him in the same spot, on the stump outside his tar paper shack, but he wasn't mending a net. He was just sitting, staring out at the tree line as the evening light bled from the sky. He looked older, if that were possible, as if the weight of the day had settled directly onto his stooped shoulders. He didn't turn as she approached, but his posture shifted, a slight tightening that told her he knew she was there. "You went out there," he said, his voice flat, devoid of its previous raspy energy. It was a statement of fact, heavy with resignation. "I had to," Alara said softly, coming to stand beside him but not sitting. The air was cool now, carrying the scent of his wood smoke and the coming night. "I saw her. I saw him. I heard the children." At that, he finally turned his head. The sorrow in his winter sky eyes was so deep it seemed bottomless. "Then you know more and most. And less than nothing, all at once." "Elias," she began, her voice gentle, pleading for context, for the human story behind the stark facts. "The old man at the store, he said that you had feelings for her. For Cora." A long, slow sigh escaped him, a sound of profound weariness. He looked down at his gnarled hands, resting on his knees. "Feelings," he repeated, the word tasting bitter. "I was a young fool with a head full of nothing. Saw her at that harvest gathering. Must be 45 years ago now. She couldn't have been more'n 16. Brightest thing I ever saw. Like a firefly in a dark room. A faint, painful smile touched his lips for a fleeting second, then vanished. Had a smile that could near stop your heart. I thought it was for me." He fell silent, lost in the memory. A whippoorwill called from the woods, its lonely cry emphasizing the quiet. "I tried to talk to her," he continued, his voice low, "just to say hello. Her brother was there in a heartbeat. Silas wasn't much older than her, but he had a man's eyes already. Cold, watchful, put himself right between us. Didn't say a word. Didn't have to. The message was clear as spring water. She was his. They were each other's. Their whole world was that cabin, their land, their twisted idea of keeping the bloodline pure. Her parents were the worst of it. Fanatics. Saw the outside world as a contamination. My interest, my few foolish words. It was an invasion to them. He shook his head slowly, the memory clearly still sharp, still painful. I came back once. Tried to leave a note for her. Tucked in a fence post near their creek. Didn't see her, but he found it. Found me. Didn't raise a hand. Didn't raise his voice. Just looked at me with those pale eyes, and I saw it plain as day. It wasn't about jealousy. It was about duty. A wall had been built around that girl from the day she was born. A wall made of that purity nonsense and her family's fear. And he was its chief keeper. There was no getting through. Not for me. Not for anyone. He looked up at Alara, his expression raw with a decades-old hurt. So I left. Not just her, this whole hollow for a long while. It wasn't her will that drove me away. It was that prison they called love. That duty. I loved the girl I thought I saw. But the woman she became, she was forged in that isolation. She never had a choice. None of them did. He turned his face back toward the darkening woods, his confession hanging in the cooling air. A story not of romance, but of a love suffocated by a fanaticism that had twisted a bright-eyed girl's life into a tragedy of isolation and loss. The whippoorwill called again, a mournful sound that seemed to underscore the old man's words. Elias's gaze remained fixed on the darkening tree line, as if he could still see the ghost of that hopeful young man he'd once been, turned away by a wall of twisted duty. When I came back years later, he continued, his voice barely more than a whisper now. The rumors were already thick as river fog. The children, always the children, pale little things seen at a distance, never in school, never in town. And Cora, she was never seen again. Not truly. Just a glimpse now and then, Hanjin wash or tend in her garden. Older than her years, her face set in lines I didn't recognize. He picked up a twig from the ground, turning it over and over in his rough fingers. I asked around, careful-like. The few who'd talked said her parents were gone by then, passed on. Left the two of them alone out there, just Cora and Silas. And the children kept coming, one after another, year after year. He broke the twig with a sharp, dry snap. The sound was startling in the quiet. That's when I understood the full horror of it. It wasn't just their parents' fanaticism anymore. It had become their world, their normal. The duty had been passed down, a cursed inheritance. They were trapped in it together, bound by that isolation, by that terrible, distorted love. He was her protector, her jailer, her brother, and the father of those children, all rolled into one. And she was the mother, the heart of it all, living a life carved out by dead people's madness. He finally looked at Alara, his eyes gleaming with unshed tears in the twilight. That's the core of the rumor, the truth of it. It wasn't some wickedness in her. It was a prison she was born into, a belief so twisted and isolated it turned family into something else. They were forced to continue it. What else did they know? The outside world had always been the enemy, and I was part of that world. Couldn't save her. Nobody could. He dropped the pieces of the twig. So you see, it ain't a story of monsters. It's a story of a loss so profound it near breaks your heart to think on it. A bright light snuffed out by a tradition of fear. The purest blood, he said, and the phrase was a curse on his lips. All it ever brought was pain. He fell silent, his confession complete. The first stars were pricking through the deep blue of the evening sky. The story was no longer a collection of rumors and ledgers and graves. It was a tragedy of a young girl's stolen life, a brother's grim duty, and a love warped into something unrecognizable by a fanaticism that valued purity over humanity. Elias's love for her had been real, but it had been hopeless from the start. crushed by an ideology that built walls not just around a cabin, but around two hearts, condemning them to a life of shared, terrible solitude. The sky, which had been a flat, leaden gray all afternoon, suddenly tore open. One moment, the woods were wrapped in a tense, breathless silence. The next, the world dissolved into a roaring chaos of wind and water. The storm had been building for hours, a pressure in the air that now released with violent suddenness. Rain fell not in drops but in sheets, a deafening roar on the canopy above that quickly soaked through Alara's jacket as she scrambled for cover. Lightning split the sky, a brilliant white fork that illuminated the woods in a stark, terrifying tableau. Trees writhing in the wind, leaves torn from branches and whipped into a frenzied dance. The crash of thunder that followed was immediate, a physical shockwave that vibrated through the ground. The path, already faint, vanished entirely under the torrent, becoming a slick channel of mud and streaming water. Alara ran, her heart hammering against her ribs, her boots slipping on the sodden earth. The wind howled through the pines, a sound like a furious animal. She had ventured farther from the cabin than she'd intended, lured by the ghostly laughter and the need to understand. And now she was hopelessly turned around, the landscape rendered alien and hostile by the storm's fury. Through the blinding rain, she spotted a darker shape against the gloom. A small, dilapidated shed tucked against the shelter of a rocky outcrop, its roof sagging but offering a promise of refuge. She stumbled toward it, yanking on the rusted metal handle. The door groaned in protest but gave way, and she fell inside, into a sudden, shocking quiet. The roar of the storm was muted here, replaced by the drumming of rain on the tin roof and the frantic beat of her own heart. The air was thick with the smells of damp wood, old earth, and something else, something faintly sweet and dusty. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, the interior of the shed resolved around her. It was not a tool shed, nor a place for storage of anything practical. It was a repository, a museum of a hidden childhood. Crude, hand-carved wooden animals, horses with knotted twine manes, birds with chipped beak profiles, lined a rough shelf, each one worn smooth by small, loving hands. A little cart, its wheels mismatched and loose, sat in one corner. But it was the shoes that held her gaze, that made the breath catch in her throat. They were arranged neatly along one wall, a heartbreaking chronology of smallness. Tiny, soft-soled moccasins made of worn deerskin, their stitching frayed. A pair of scuffed leather boots, so small they would fit a toddler, the soles worn thin from running on hard-packed earth. A little girl's black patent leather shoe, its strap broken and carefully mended with a scrap of wire, sitting beside its mate. Dozens of them, each pair telling a silent story of a life lived in these woods, of running, playing, growing. They were not discarded. They were preserved, each tiny shoe a testament to a child who had been here, loved, and had outgrown them. Alara stood in the center of the shed, the storm raging outside, surrounded by the quiet, poignant evidence of the family's hidden life. The horror of the ledger's dashes and the silent graveyard was suddenly, devastatingly humanized. These were not just names or markers. They were children who had played with carved toys and worn-out little shoes. The tragedy was no longer an abstract concept. It was a collection of worn leather and whittled wood, and it was more overwhelming than any thunder crashing against the tin roof above. The storm's fury was a distant roar, muffled by the shed's thin walls and the heavy, sorrowful silence within. Alara stood motionless, her hand hovering over a tiny, wire-mended shoe, the weight of its history pressing down on her. The air was thick with the ghosts of childhoods lived in shadow, each worn toy and outgrown pair a testament to lives the world was never meant to see. A sound cut through the drumming rain. Not the wind, not the creak of the old structure. It was a small, thin cry, barely audible at first, then growing clearer. A child's voice, trembling with fear and cold. "Mama!" Alara's head snapped up. She turned toward the door, which she had pulled mostly closed against the weather. Through the narrow gap, she saw a flash of movement in the sheeting rain. She pushed the door open wider. Standing there, drenched and shivering, was a small boy. He couldn't have been more than 5 or 6, his hair plastered to his forehead, his clothes, a simple homespun shirt and trousers, soaked through. His skin was pale, almost luminous in the storm's gloom, and his eyes were wide with a terror that was entirely, heart-wrenchingly real. He took a stumbling step back as the door moved, his small frame trembling violently. "It's all right," Alara said softly, keeping her voice low and calm, making no sudden movements. She knelt, bringing herself to his eye level. The rain lashed at her back. "You're lost." The boy's lower lip quivered. He looked past her into the dim shed, his eyes scanning the familiar toys, the rows of small shoes, and some of the fear in his face eased, replaced by a desperate longing for home. "Mama Cora," he whimpered, his voice barely a whisper. Then, a little louder, more urgent, "Papa Silas." The names, spoken in that small, frightened voice, landed with the force of a physical blow. There was no rumor in it, no speculation. It was a simple, devastating fact. A child, lost in a storm, calling for his mother and his father, his uncle. Alara's journalistic detachment, already frayed by the graveyard and the shed's quiet relics, dissolved entirely. This was not a story. This was a cold, terrified child. "Come inside," she said, her voice gentle. Out of the rain, she moved back slowly, giving him space. Hesitantly, driven by cold and fear, the boy took a few steps into the shed. He didn't look at her, his eyes fixed on the little cart in the corner, a familiar anchor in the storm. He wrapped his arms around himself, his teeth chattering. Alara shrugged out of her own damp jacket, which was still drier than his soaked clothes. "Here," she said, holding it out. "It's big, but it's warm." He stared at the offered jacket for a long moment. Then, with a tiny, jerky nod, he allowed her to drape it over his shoulders. It swallowed him, the sleeves hanging far past his hands. He clutched the fabric, pulling it tight around him. "We'll find them," Alara said, kneeling again. "Mama Cora and Papa Silas. I'll help you find your way home." The boy looked at her then, really looked at her, his fear now mingled with a faint, tentative trust. He gave another small nod. In his eyes, she saw not the product of a monstrous ideology, but the simple, universal need of a lost child for the safety of his parents. The complex horror of his origin fell away, leaving only the immediate, human need to deliver him from the storm and back into the arms of the isolated, tragic world that was all he had ever known. The storm's rage had subsided to a steady, soaking drizzle by the time Alara and the boy left the shed. The world was washed clean and muted, every leaf and branch dripping, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and pine. The small hand in hers was cold and trusting, his steps hesitant as he navigated the slick, unfamiliar path. He knew the general direction, pointing with a small, trembling finger deeper into the woods whenever she paused, his other hand clutching the oversized jacket tightly around his thin shoulders. The cabin emerged from the gray mist like a specter, its dark logs streaming with water, the sagging porch a haven of relative dryness. As they drew closer, the door flew open before they had even reached the bottom of the missing steps. Cora stood there, her usually stoic face a mask of raw, undisguised panic. Her eyes, those sharp, pale wells of history, were wide, scanning the tree line until they landed on the boy. A sound escaped her, a choked, gasping thing that was part relief, part anguish. She moved with a speed that belied her age, scrambling down from the porch with a painful, graceless urgency, her worn dress instantly darkening with moisture. She fell to her knees in the wet leaves, her arms opening. The boy let go of Alara's hand and ran the last few steps, crashing into her embrace with a muffled sob. "My boy," Cora whispered, her voice cracking. She clutched him to her, her gnarled hands pressing his small head against her shoulder, her eyes squeezing shut. For a fleeting moment, the stern matriarch, the keeper of the terrible secret, was gone. In her place was simply a mother, her facade shattered by the terror of loss and the overwhelming wave of relief. She rocked him gently, murmuring words too low for Alara to hear, her love for him a palpable force in the damp, quiet clearing. Then, as swiftly as it had broken, the moment passed. Cora's eyes opened, and they found Alara. The vulnerability vanished, sealed away behind the familiar, impenetrable mask of weary resilience. She stood, pulling the boy up with her, one arm still wrapped protectively around him. She gave a single, curt nod of acknowledgement to Alara, a gesture that contained a universe of thanks, warning, and dismissal all at once. Silas appeared in the doorway behind her, his tall frame filling the space. His gaze swept over the boy, checking for injury, then settled on Alara. There was no gratitude in his look, but a sharp, assessing intensity. He was ensuring the child was whole, and that the outsider's role was now complete. His priority was the boy's safety and the reinstatement of their isolation. As Cora shepherded the child up onto the porch and inside, Silas remained for a moment longer, his watchful eyes on Alara, a silent sentinel ensuring the boundary of their world was firmly back in place before he, too, turned and disappeared into the cabin, closing the door softly on the rain and the stranger who had briefly entered their lives. The rain fell in a soft, steady whisper, a gentle aftermath to the storm's fury. Alara stood alone in the clearing, the damp chill seeping through her clothes. The cabin door was closed, the brief window into Cora's vulnerability shut tight. The silence that returned was different now, heavier, layered with the echoes of the child's frightened voice and the raw love in Cora's embrace. She turned to leave, her mind a whirlwind of emotion, compassion, horror, a profound sense of trespass. But as she took a step toward the drowned path, the cabin door creaked open again. Silas stood there, not filling the frame as he usually did, but simply present. In his hands he held a large, leather-bound book, its cover dark with age and stained with what looked like watermarks and tears. He did not speak. His eyes, those pale, piercing sentinels, met hers across the distance. There was no threat in them now, only a deep, weary resignation. He extended the book toward her, a silent offering, a burden to be passed. Alara approached slowly, her boots sinking into the sodden earth. She took the ledger from him. The leather was cool and slightly rough under her fingers, the spine cracked with use. Silas's gaze held hers for a moment longer, a silent communication of the weight she now held. Then he turned and retreated into the cabin, closing the door once more without a sound. Alone again, Alara stood in the drizzle, the ledger feeling like a live thing in her hands. She found a relatively dry spot beneath the shelter of a large, broad-leafed magnolia and sank onto a moss-covered log. With trembling fingers, she opened the cover. The pages were thick, yellowed at the edges, filled with lines of delicate, precise handwriting. Cora's hand. The ink varied, sometimes a sharp, dark black, other times a faded brown, and in a few places, a watery blue, as if written with great effort or profound sorrow. It was a chronicle of life and death, meticulously kept. Each entry was a stark, simple line. Asterisk Elijah. Born, March 12, 1961. Died, March 29, 1961. Cause, fever star. Asterisk Lena. Born, January 5, 1963. Died, January 5, 1963. Cause weak heart star. Asterisk Samuel. Born, November 22, 1964. Died, August 14, 1966. Cause wasting star. Asterisk Hope. Born, September 3, 1966. Died, September 3, 1966. Cause, stillborn star. Asterisk Benjamin. Born, July 17, 1968. Died, star. The entries went on, page after page, a relentless march of names and dates spanning decades. The causes of death were a litany of genetic tragedy. Asterisk fever, weak heart, wasting, stillborn, blue at birth asterisk, each one a clinical term for a profound personal loss. The sheer number was staggering, a brutal arithmetic of a belief system's cost. Alara's finger traced the names. 20 of them. She had counted the graves, and now she knew their names. Elijah, Lena, Samuel, Hope, Benjamin. The list went on, each name a child who had been loved, swaddled, and buried under a small stone in the sunken clearing. As the years progressed, the entries changed. The handwriting, once neat and steady, grew shakier. The ink sometimes bled, as if from a teardrop. The dates between births grew longer. The last few entries were sparse, the script frail, the words written with a visible tremor. William, born May 10, 1989, died, star. Annie, born February 2, 1992, died, star. These were the survivors, the ones whose laughter sometimes echoed in the woods, the ones whose small shoes filled the shed. Alara closed the ledger gently, the soft thud of the cover a final, solemn period to the story. It was not a ledger of secrets. It was a book of grief, a mother's record of love and loss, written in a hand that grew weaker with each passing year, each tiny grave. The truth was not in the rumor of purity, but in the cold, hard evidence of its price, recorded in Cora's delicate, failing script. The horror was no longer in the act, but in the devastating, relentless aftermath, laid bare in the quiet, rain-soaked woods. The rain had softened to a fine mist, veiling the woods in a spectral gray. Alara sat on the damp log beneath the magnolia, the ledger heavy on her lap, its weight more than physical. The names and dates swam before her eyes, a litany of loss written in a failing hand. The door of the cabin remained closed, but she felt the presence of its inhabitants as keenly as the chill in the air. She had come for a story, and now she held its heart, brittle and breaking, in her hands. The creak of the cabin door was barely audible over the whisper of the rain. Alara looked up. Cora stood on the porch, her figure a stark silhouette against the dim interior. She did not beckon, did not speak. She simply stepped down into the wet clearing, moving with a stiff, deliberate grace, and came to stand before Alara. Her sharp, pale eyes were not on the journalist, but on the ledger. "You have the accounting," Cora said, her voice a dry rasp, like leaves skittering over stone. It was the first time she had initiated speech. "The numbers, the dates, but numbers don't bleed. They don't cry in the night." Alara remained silent, offering the book back. Cora ignored the gesture, her gaze lifting to the dripping trees, seeing something far beyond them. "They called it duty," she began, and the word was hollow, stripped of any meaning but exhaustion. "My mother's word, my father's law. It was hammered into us before we could walk. The world outside was a contamination, a sin. Our blood was a trust, a sacred thing to be kept pure. It wasn't a choice. It was the air we breathed." She fell silent for a long moment, her arms wrapped around herself as if against a cold only she could feel. "Silas?" she said, and a complex pain flickered in her eyes. A deep, worn affection layered with an old, familiar sorrow. "He was my world, my only friend, my protector. We were two saplings grown twisted together in the same small patch of ground. There was no one else. Ever." Her voice grew quieter, almost a whisper. "It wasn't what the world thinks. It wasn't a romance from a storybook. It was a shared sentence, a life sentence. When our parents were gone, the duty didn't die with them. It became us. It was all we knew, the only language we'd ever been taught. He did it out of loyalty, out of love for me, I think, in his way, to spare me from bearing that duty alone. And I did it because it was the only path that had ever been laid before my feet." She finally looked at Alara, and her eyes were pools of decades-deep resignation. "I loved my brother, but not as a wife loves a husband. I loved him as my only companion in a prison of our parents' making. I loved the children we made together with a fierceness that near tore me in two every time. And I buried them, one after the other. I buried them with my own hands under those stones. That is the purity they worshipped. That is the price of the purest blood." Her hand, gnarled and trembling, came to rest on the cover of the ledger. "The world would call it a sin," a monstrosity. But it was just life, the only one we were ever given. Cora's hand remained on the ledger, her knuckles white against the worn leather. The mist settled on her lashes like tiny diamonds, but her eyes were dry, all tears long since spent. The ones who lived, she continued, her voice low and steady, as if reciting a grim, well-worn truth. The few who were strong enough, they were my purpose. And my penance. She looked toward the cabin, her gaze softening for a fraction of a second. Every breath they took was a defiance of the weakness that took the others. Every laugh I heard from the woods was a gift I never thought I'd earn. But the world out there, her voice hardened, the protective shell snapping back into place. The world you come from, it wouldn't see them as children. It would see them as a scandal, a curiosity, a thing to be gawked at, written about, torn apart. She turned her sharp eyes back to Alara, and in them was a fire that had been banked for decades. They've known nothing but this land, this air. They know Silas as their papa. They know me as their mama. They know the trees and the creek and the sound of the wind at night. They don't know cruelty. They don't know judgment. They have never seen a look of disgust or heard a whispered word. Her hand lifted from the ledger, gesturing to the dense wall of trees that encircled them. This is not a hiding place. It is a sanctuary. I kept them here, away from the world, not to punish them, but to protect them from its rot. From the very thing that would point and stare and call them monsters for the sin of being born. Their blood is what it is, but their hearts are pure. And that is the only purity that ever mattered. She fell silent, her chest rising and falling with a slow, weary rhythm. The confession was complete. It was not a justification, but an explanation forged in loss and a fierce, twisted love. The children were her life's work, the survivors of a terrible genetic legacy, and she had built them a fortress of isolation to shield them from a world she believed was far more monstrous. Her story was one of devastating duty, profound grief, and a mother's resolve to protect the few precious things she had left, no matter the cost. The mist thickened, wrapping the clearing in a soft, gray shroud. Cora's words hung in the air, a final, unadorned truth that settled over Alara with the weight of the ancient trees. The ledger on her lap was no longer just a book. It was a testament to a life defined by duty, loss, and a fierce, protective love that had chosen isolation as its only shield. Cora turned without another word and walked back to the cabin, her steps slow and heavy on the wet earth. The door closed behind her with a soft, final click, leaving Alara alone with the silence and the weight of the choice now laid bare before her. She sat on the damp log, the chill of the wood seeping through her jeans, and looked down at the ledger. Her fingers traced the faded script of the names. Elijah, Lena, Samuel, Hope, each one a life briefly held and profoundly mourned. She thought of the small, mended shoes in the shed, the whittled toys, the echo of laughter in the trees. She thought of the boy, his small hand trusting in hers, calling for Mama Cora and Papa Silas. The story was hers now, all of it, the dashes in the church record, the 20 sunken graves, the twisted ideology, the devastating love, the surviving children hidden in their green sanctuary. It was a story of monumental tragedy and profound, heartbreaking humanity, a story the world would devour. She could see the headlines, the sensationalized articles, the documentaries that would swarm this quiet hollow. They would reduce Cora to a monster, Silas to a villain, the children to freaks. They would tear apart the fragile world they had built, exposing them to a cruelty far greater than any genetic flaw. The sanctuary would be violated, the grief made into a spectacle, where she could leave. She could drive away from these mist-shrouded woods and let the legend remain what it had always been, a haunting, half-true whisper. She could let the tragedy remain theirs, a private burden carried in silence. The children could keep their innocence, their world unbroken by the harsh light of outside judgment. It was not a choice between truth and lies. It was a choice between exposure and empathy, between the world's right to know and the family's right to peace. The mist began to lift slightly, the outlines of the trees sharpening against the gray sky. Alara stood, the ledger heavy in her hands. She walked to the porch steps and set the book down gently on the warped boards, a silent return of their history. She took one last look at the cabin, at the smoke beginning to curl from the chimney, at the quiet, enduring fact of their existence. Then she turned and walked away, leaving the truth where it belonged, with them. The choice was made. The gravel of the logging road crunched beneath her tires, a steady, rhythmic sound marking her retreat. In the rearview mirror, the woods receded, a solid wall of green and shadow swallowing the narrow track, erasing all evidence of the path she had taken. The mist had burned away, leaving the Kentucky hills sharp and clear under a high, pale sky, but the clarity felt like a lie. The truth was back there, hidden, a world within a world. Alara's hands were steady on the wheel, but her mind was a storm of quiet turmoil. The ledger's weight was gone from her lap, but its contents were etched into her memory. The names, the dates, the failing script of a mother's endless grief. She saw Cora's resigned eyes, Silas's silent guardianship, the small, trusting hand of the lost boy. She had gone into the woods seeking a story and had found a wound, deep and private, and she had chosen to let it scar over in peace. She would not write it. The notepad on the passenger seat, which had held only a cryptic line, would remain that way. To reduce that profound, layered tragedy to paragraphs and publish it would be a violation far greater than her initial trespass. It would be picking at a scab that had taken a lifetime to form, and for what? For curiosity. For a byline? The cost was too high. The children's laughter deserved to remain their own secret, not a soundbite for the world to dissect. The rental car reached the paved road, the hum of the asphalt a jarring transition from the quiet of the woods. She rolled down the window, letting the humid, familiar air rush in, trying to wash the clinging sense of sorrow from her skin. She was leaving it behind. She had to. But as the miles stretched out, the dense woods giving way to scattered farms and then to the outskirts of the small town, a sound seemed to travel with her, carried on the wind whistling through the window. It was faint, almost imperceptible, woven into the rush of air and the whine of the tires. It was laughter, high, lilting, ethereal. She turned down the radio, her heart seizing. She strained to listen, her eyes scanning the passing fields, the empty road. There was nothing there. Of course, there was nothing there. It was the wind, her imagination, her mind replaying the haunting chorus that had circled Cora's cabin. Yet, for a moment it was unmistakable. The joyful, carefree echo of children at play, a secret melody from a hidden hollow, a sound that belonged to another time, another world. A truth she now carried, forever blurring the line between memory and myth, between the living and the lost. She rolled up the window. The car was silent again. But the echo remained, not in her ears, but in her soul. A whisper from the Kentucky woods, a story she would keep, a testament to a tragedy that was, finally, not hers to tell. The road ahead was open, but a part of her would always be in that sunken clearing, amidst the quiet graves and the watchful trees, forever holding the weight of their silence.